Hi, my name is Leah Day, and welcome to this video for the Building Blocks Quilt Along. We are on block number 7 and learning our first quilting design on our disappearing 9-patch block. This design is lines and stars, and so it's basically a lot of straight lines and sharp angles. And you combine that with our disappearing 9-patch, we're going to have a lot of travel stitching. I've already figured out a way of stitching in the ditch with this block in a way that minimizes your travel stitching. So let's check out the design and I can share those tips with you. Okay, as for stitching in the ditch, I started here and stitched down, all the way down along these big blocks. I came over and went ahead and kind of did a figure 8 around that little square. Came back over, and this is where it got a little tricky. How I wanted to place this, I wanted to go on ahead and knock out these stitch lines too. So what I did was stitch diagonally across, then do that figure 8 around and down, and then I did the same thing here. So I stitched over, hit that diagonal, then around and down, got back here and finished up ditching around this big square. So if you need to rewind the video so that you can see that a couple different times, definitely take some time to trace your finger around your block too. This is a complex block, but that is a really good way of knocking it out with the least amount of travel stitching. Okay, so here's the block on the machine, and you can see the areas that I've marked completely. I've marked all of these straight lines simply because those would probably be pretty hard to freehand quilt without them having marked, just quilting them straight, that kind of thing. So I made sure to mark all of those. However, the stars are simple enough to stitch freehand. You don't necessarily need to mark all of those lines. What you do need to know is where the center of the star is, because you'll be stitching in off the edges and you're wanting the lines to all kind of line up or correlate with that center. So I just marked some diagonals into these squares that I left open, and that's going to work out fine. Also, these itsy bitsy tiny squares, you don't have to mark those. You can probably freehand that too, or you can leave them completely open. If you don't like the idea of having an intense star in those corners, you don't have to stitch it. So that's what I've started with, and I've already ditched my block. You can see all those lines, and now it's time to fill it. So I think the first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and knock out this square here. And just in case you're wondering, a lot of people are asking me about my marking pencils. I'm using the Fons Importer ceramic marking pencil to mark all of my blocks. Okay, so let's get started. And knock out this diagonal. And this is another situation where we kind of have to really pay attention to the block, pay attention to the designs going on, and figure out ways that we can knock out the most travel stitching as we go. Okay, I kind of want to work my way to get into the middle here so I can knock out one of my horizontal lines. And I've got these little teeth right here, so I can knock out those two things at the same time. I'm just going to stitch on down, go over along that outer perimeter line, now stitch in the ditch, come back down. This is careful stitching. It's going to be a little time consuming, but I think all of these lines are really going to make the block stand out beautifully. I think it's a nice additional texture to the block. I like to play with that idea of, a little bit of a denser design kind of going all around a slightly more open design. I think it looks really fun. Okay, I think I'm about in the midpoint of that block. It looks roughly like midpoint. I might stitch over just a little bit and then just come down with a straight line. Doesn't have to be perfect. I think I was a little off, but that's okay. No big deal. Okay, in this situation there's no choice but to travel stitch on down. Yeah, if I wanted to, I could go on ahead and knock out some of these lines too, but I think I'll just stay focused on knocking out this big what is this again? A big star first. So I'm going to come in, kind of judging the space, the distance, running through the midpoint of those lines. What I was basically saying is I was looking at this marked line and I was looking at this line I'd already stitched, and I was judging what is the middle as I stitched that straight line right through the center. Now I'm going to travel stitch. Ooh, or can I knock out some of these teeth? Let's see here. I can. Let me treble stitch down and I can knock out all the rest of the teeth in that line. If this seems a little distracting or confusing to you, just please understand that there's no right or wrong way to quilt your block. If you want to stitch all the stars kind of in a very linear way, if you want to stitch all of these little straight lines in a very linear way, that's perfectly fine. I'm more interested in knocking out as much as I can at any pass. And so I'm always interested in, you know, okay, well, I'm right here, so how do I get to the next place, and how do I knock out something along the way? So speaking of knocking something out, I just took a minute real quick right there to knock out that little star. And now I can stitch down and knock out this line, and I've got 2 stars really nearly done. And with these straight lines, you know, you might want to even say, okay, well, I'm running this diagonal, how about I just go all the way down and hit all of these diagonals at once? And that's definitely a good idea, just so it's one continuous line, because that's one of those things I picked up with after quilting for a while. If you have a block where there is a straight diagonal line running all the way through the entire thing, it can be a little noticeable if, you know, like you have just kind of the lines don't perfectly match up as you go from block to block or square from square. So that's something to kind of keep in mind. I just decided I'd go on ahead and stitch down and knock out this little corner. These little guys can be a little tricky because they're right here on the edge of the quilt, and you just have to get a good grip of the quilt and carefully swing it around as you're stitching this. If it's not perfect, please don't worry about it. Honestly, the binding will probably overlap this area just a little bit, so it's not going to be the end of the world if it's not stitched exactly, or if you don't even want to stitch it, that's perfectly fine too. Okay, so with that knocked out, I'm going to start knocking out these straight lines. Just kind of flows through the block. I'm just going to speed up the video camera so you can see me working through it. I'm going to back up the camera so you can get a good perspective on everything that I do. Okay, so that's it for stitching lines and stars in our disappearing 9-patch block. As you can see, I kind of bounced around a lot. I stitched part of a star, and then I started doing some lines, and then I went to another star, and I really bounced around this block a considerable amount. I wanted to give you a taste. Right now, you know, 7th block, we're more than halfway through this project. I wanted to give you a taste of how I would really quilt. And that involves some bouncing around, some, you know, stitching one part of something, and then I feel like, well, I can flow through this area and then get back to this, let me do that. It's a constant process of kind of looking at it and evaluating it and making that next move. There's no right or wrong way of doing this. I do want to emphasize that. If you find this really confusing and you're looking at it going, well, how do I do this? You know, how do should I stitch all the stars first? Should I stitch all the straight lines first? The thing to understand is do it however it makes sense to you in your brain. That's what's important. This is the way it made sense to me. The really useful analogy for it would be Legos. My son and I build Legos together. We play with Legos all the time. And he has a certain way of building. Let's say we're both building a house. His house is going to be very different from my house. But we're both building houses. So it doesn't really matter how we build. In the end, we're going to end up with the same thing. So what does it matter? We're going to end up with a house. In this case, we're going to end up with a quilt block. So I hope you keep that in mind. There's no right or wrong way of doing this. And if you find this confusing, sit down with your quilting guide. Sit down and just draw, trace. Take some time to get familiar with it and figure out where you're going to go and how you're going to get there. Practice is never a waste of time. It's never going to waste your time or somehow take away from your finished block. It's always a good thing. So the more you can sit down and get familiar with it, the better and more confident you're going to feel quilting it. So I hope you'll keep all of those things in mind and join us for the next block. My name is Leah Day, and this has been a video for the Building Blocks Quilt Along. Pick up your copy of the Building Blocks quilt pattern and join us as we learn how to piece and quilt 42 beautiful blocks together. You can find the pattern at leahday.com. Until next time, let's go quilt.